Well, hello and welcome along to a sort of solo duo We Happy Few 506 podcast. Dougie's having a root canaled, whatever that entails, I don't know. But there were some mumbling messages from a Berlin basement. So either he's having something removed or he's being turned into the Joker. One of two. So it'll be an interesting week next week. So anyway, it kind of works out well-ish because I've got the one and only Chris Mowery on. Hey, Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing great, and I've had 5 root canals, so I feel Doug's pain.
Oh wow. So I wanted to nerd out about World War One, which I think might have killed Doug. If he'd have had the pain from a root canal and us nerding out about World War One, he may not have come back ever. Um, so anyway, let me just get started with how you got started, Chris, because we met on our tours.
Yeah.
And I've latterly got really into your videos, actually, in a slightly creepy way, like I'm watching at least two a day. So
You got to get caught up. There's like 1,000 of them, so it's
there's
okay.
200,000 of them, ranging from many topics, as I've teased you about many times.
Yeah.
How did
Yeah. So, you and I are about the same age, so you're slightly older, but I majored in history in college, and my goal had always been to actually be a history professor. That was kind of what I wanted to do with my life, and life kind of took a different turn when I was in college, and I ended up going in a very different direction. And but I always had this, this love for history, this passion for it, but no outlet for it. And I would substitute teach here and there, but um, I started speaking for an organization called Rachel's Challenge, where I work for the family of one of the victims of the Columbine shooting, and we share her story, which is all about kindness and compassion and how kids treat each other and stuff. And but it was like a very busy couple months of the year, and then the rest of the year I was doing nothing. So I thought, why not start a YouTube channel and see what happens with it? And my daughter was actually the first big YouTuber in our house. She had over 100,000 subscribers playing
yeah,
Roblox, playing this video game. And I'm like, well, that looks easy, right? It's not easy. It's really, really hard to grow an audience like that. But I started vlogging through history with the idea of traveling around and just doing vlogs talking about historic sites. But then COVID hit and I couldn't travel. So somebody said, well, why don't you do reaction videos to like Sabaton, this Swedish metal band that does songs about history? And I'm like, that's a dumb idea, but I've got nothing else to do, so why not? And it took off instantly. Hit 100,000 subscribers in like 3 months, and I've been doing it full time since about 5 months after I started the channel. So
I'm
it
starting to
became
think if
the
someone says to you,
reactions. What's
yeah,
that?
so I'm starting to think if someone says to you, start a YouTube channel, do it. Because isn't JD Hewitt's story exactly the same? That's a dumb idea. No one will watch that.
Exactly, exactly. And he started his not long before I did, and ours grew at kind of the same rate. And both of us suffered deeply from what they call imposter syndrome, where it's like, is this really my life? Are people really watching me talk about history on the internet? It's so weird. 500,000 people actually care enough to subscribe to what I do. So yeah, here we are. And I love it, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. And that's how you and I met. Is
Yeah.
the channel made it possible for me to go on that tour, and been going to Europe like 5 or 6 times a year ever since.
Yeah, it's so cool. It really is. It's amazing. I like I say, like I have now seriously got into watching your videos, and they're great. I do love the reaction videos. I think they're so cool. I don't know who the first person that came up with that concept is, but it's brilliant. It's so simple.
Yeah, and
So
on one
effective.
hand, I think how dumb. Why would anybody want to do that? But then I
Yeah,
noticed that I do it too. When Game of Thrones was really big, I would watch Game of Thrones, and then the next day I'd be on the internet watching everybody else's reaction to what I just watched. It's
yeah,
so
yeah.
weird that we are into that.
Yeah, I had an idea. I'm too lazy to get it off the ground, but I had an idea where I was going to do reaction videos to people's criticisms of films. So I was going to critique the critique, like just because I know a bit about what goes into making a film and
Right.
stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And that's a popular genre of reactions are people with specific expertise or knowledge in an area, like watching a pilot talk about pilot scenes in movies, stuff like
Yeah,
that. So, I mean, there's definitely an audience for it.
yeah. Like I say, I'm too lazy though. Um, like on a slightly more serious note, because a lot of people I know, I mean, a lot of personal friends, they're like, "My God, Chris Mowery, or JD Hewitt, or I love that stuff. But is it slightly under threat at the moment for what's happening on YouTube with what you? I did watch a video where you described it as a sort of censorship of history.
Yeah, and you know, like anything on the internet, we use these buzzwords to catch an audience, and you could argue the semantics of is it really censorship, but it's kind of a de facto censorship because what's happening is as YouTube has all of these policies about, you know, the way you make money on YouTube is the ad revenue.
Mhm.
Everybody gets frustrated with having to skip ads and stuff like that, but that's why people make YouTube content because they can make ad revenue from it. And so YouTube has on one hand their creators, but on the other hand, they have these huge companies that are spending billions in advertising revenue. And so they have to make sure that the audience can make content, but also that the ad revenue, you know, that these companies are okay with the channels that are the ads are running on. And so they've kind of cracked down on certain topics. And so you learn pretty quickly as a history content creator what you can and cannot talk about and what you can and can't say. So for example, we don't talk about Hitler, we talk about the Australian painter with the mustache because that word can trigger YouTube's algorithm to demonetize your video. Uh,
Wow.
Certain topics, the Holocaust, 9/11 is the one I dealt with this past week, was just images of the Twin Towers will get your video demonetized. A swastika on the screen for 2 seconds on a 40-minute video can get you demonetized. So there's all these things you have to do. And so what it ends up happening then is that people making history videos will start to avoid certain topics because they don't want the headache of that. So while nobody's censoring them from making the content, nobody's going to put all that time and effort into making a video when they know that YouTube's going to ban it from making any money. So they'll just make a video on a topic that does make money. So it ends up being kind of a censorship in that sense.
How long does it take to make a YouTube video? I mean, when you, like you've probably, I think you might have a team now. You don't have to answer, you don't have to
Yeah.
give away
So
all your secrets, but like when you start now, is it? I mean, I thought I'd give it a go for a while. This is why I'm saying this, and I just never got past the actual filming stage. It's like the editing and all the rest of it. I was like,
yeah,
we're going to do a whole lot of these. And no, I'm not.
it depends entirely on what your content is. And I know, I mean, most channels the size of mine, you know, I'm probably going to hit 500,000 subscribers by early next year. Most channels of that size do have like they pay someone else to edit their videos, and you know they pay someone to write content. Um, you know, JD and I, we do pretty much everything ourselves. Um, so that does make it take longer. So yeah, like I said, it depends on the video. So the video I did yesterday where I was talking about this issue with monetization and censorship, that was really no planning. I sat down, I opened up my recording software, I just started talking and did a minor amount of editing at the end, you know, showing some screenshots of some things. The whole process for that video took me about an hour,
Mm.
including editing. But I have an advantage in that I've been in public speaking all my life, so I can kind of BS my way through just about anything off the top of my head and be
Be
coherent with it.
quiet, brother.
Yeah. So yeah, actors same way. Yeah, but other videos it's a different story. So if I go to World War I battlefields, for example, I'm doing months of research before I
Right.
go, and by months I mean, you know, maybe 20 hours a week, just doing research, figuring out where I'm gonna go, figuring out what I want to talk about, putting it all together in notes. And then, you know, a 20-minute video might take me 2 hours of recording on site and then maybe 10 hours of editing to do that. So there's a lot more work. I mean, you know, the average 20-minute video on a World War I battlefield probably involved 30 or 40 hours of work for me total for something like that. So the reaction videos far less because that's mainly just me going off of knowledge. I don't want to say that it didn't take me any work because I'm 47 and I've spent 35 years studying those topics to put
Mhm.
myself in the place where I can talk about that stuff without doing research. So, yeah, so it depends entirely on what you're doing, but most people with a 500,000 subscribers have at least a team of people they're paying to help out.
How do you pick your reaction videos? Do you think, oh, I know about this, or do you think I want to challenge myself?
It's actually both. And you know, the one thing I try to avoid is because I do videos I probably do 5 videos a week. I don't want to get into a rut where I'm talking about the same topic because there's only so much you can say about the American Civil War. There's only so much you can say about Gettysburg. There's only so much you can say about King James the First, you know. So I do try to get out of my wheelhouse a little bit. I am trying to learn new topics. World War One was something 5 years ago I wasn't into at all, and now I'm on a History Channel documentary about World War One. That never was on my radar that that would happen. So that came from me watching a video, and I thought, wow, this is an interesting topic. I'm going to do more about it. So that's part of it. I take recommendations from people a lot.
Right.
I'm always asking people to make suggestions. So I'm always looking for new channels to check out. And one of the cool things about it is that now, because of the size of my channel, I can shine a spotlight on smaller channels and say, hey, you guys should really check out this channel. They're doing great work, but for whatever reason, people haven't noticed them yet. And the 10,000 subscriber channel getting exposure on a 500,000 subscriber channel can go a long way for them. So that's part of it is finding those videos nobody's found yet and talking about those.
Yeah, and what I really dig about YouTubers that I've met is that's not false modesty for anyone who's listening. The YouTubers really do help one another out, and it's the most nurturing people. It's kind of
Oh
weird.
yeah.
I think someone like JD and yourself might butt heads a little bit, or be like, what's he doing? And they're so nurturing of one another, and they pop up on
Yeah.
one another stuff, and it's all about trying to get the guys who, just like we've just said, who haven't got a lot of supporters up because
Yeah.
we're all kind of doing the same thing. It's just I don't know. Some people just kind of like catch people's imagination, and some people are like they put out great content, and you can see
Yeah.
the work in it. There's a couple of guys that come on our tour. You'll know what I'm talking about. I don't want to name them, and they seem like they put so much work and effort into it, but perhaps they're not quite.
Yeah.
I don't know, grasping people's imagination for whatever reason. And I've seen you help those guys out a whole bunch of times.
Yeah, that the YouTube algorithm is this mysterious thing that nobody, even people with millions of subscribers, seems to understand. You know how a channel can take off and do really well, and what videos are going to do well. Because every guy I know that does this, we make a video and we're like, this is the one. This is the video that's going to be amazing and get all the views, and then it bombs, and you're like, I don't understand. And then a video you didn't really think would do well does. Channels are the same way. But yeah, we are absolutely all huge fans of each other. And I have had so much support along the way from channels much bigger than mine, guys I've done reactions to that, their channel doesn't need the exposure that I can give because they're 5 times my size, and yet they reach out. I've had channels, I've done a reaction to them, and within 10 minutes, they're reaching out. Hey, I loved what you did. Keep it up. Anything I can do to help. We really, truly are huge fans of each other and love to see each other succeed.
So, what's your favorite topic to talk about? Is the Civil War?
American Civil War and World War One are probably the two. Maybe U.S. presidents on top of that, but I think right now, at least for the last couple of years, World War One has been kind of my favorite.
What did the History Channel have you talk about?
So on the History Channel, we for the one that already aired back in May, that was it was called The Great War, and it was focused on American involvement in World War One, and how that came about was the well, it's two things. One was a history professor in San Antonio who was also on it, named James Early. He has a podcast, and um, but he was a fan of my YouTube channel, and he kind of told them about me, and then they went and watched some of my videos from the Western Front that I did on World War One battlefields, and they're like, "Oh, let's bring this guy in." So I did a Zoom call with them. They threw some questions at me to see how I responded, and next thing I knew, I was going out to Minneapolis to record in a little attic of this building in 100-degree heat in a suit. And so it was hot, but it was a fantastic experience. And then I got to do it again for something I can't really talk about yet, but is going to be airing starting in November. It's a TV series on the History Channel, and I'll be in like 4 episodes of that, talking about all kinds of different topics. And that one came about because one of the producers of that show, her boyfriend was a fan of my YouTube channel and said, "Hey, you should call this guy." And that's how it came about.
Really?
Yep, it's
That's
funny how those connections happen.
okay. So this is a question I was going to slip in. It's slightly facetious, but I did comment on it on your YouTube channel on the comments. What? What's the deal with these real historians that keep reaching out to YouTube historians, correcting you and all the rest of it? And is your being on the History Channel gonna poke a few bubbles? I don't know. What do you think?
That's a great question. I mean, there anytime you have an audience of hundreds of thousands of people, and actually, when we talk about an audience, like a subscriber count of a 500,000 people, what that really means is that's the number of people who have subscribed to your channel. There's millions of people that are watching these videos, and in the in the big sea of YouTube, I'm a small fish. But um, when you are exposed to that many people, there are going to be those ones who think they know more than everybody else about a topic, and they do in some cases. I mean, we jokingly refer to them sometimes as like thread counters, the people who
Right.
have a really niche knowledge of a topic that very few people do. And because
Yeah.
you didn't mention it or because you got that little thing wrong, I'm sure you've experienced this with Band of Brothers. There are those people who say, that tank wouldn't have done that in that situation, or that's not exactly what words were spoken there, and those kinds of things. You always get that. And especially because most of my videos are me just going off of knowledge that I've learned in the last 30 years. Occasionally, I misspeak. I remember something slightly wrong, and the community will be there very quickly to remind you of that. And I try to acknowledge that. And if somebody points out something major wrong in a video, I'll pin their comment and let everybody see it. I have no problem with that. My goal is that we all learn, but I also encourage people to do so in a way that's respectful. Like, you don't have to be a jerk about telling me that I'm wrong. You can say, "Hey, this was wrong," but you don't have to say, "You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. Why do you even have a YouTube channel?" That kind of
Yes.
thing.
And then put a bunch of letters after your own name, PhD, ASB, something or other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
No.
I go out of my way to remind people because I think a lot of people get hung up on this term historian. And if you look at the dictionary definition of historian, all it means is that somebody who is knowledgeable of history and then shares that history with other people. That's literally all it means. It's not about writing a bunch of books, having a doctorate, working in a university, any of that stuff. It just means that you are somebody who's passionate about history and passionate about teaching that to other people. That's it. I don't know. Some people really, really get worked up about that stuff, but I don't really. You have to have a thick skin to do YouTube, so I just don't worry about it.
I just think like I don't know, sands are changing, seas are shifting. I don't know how to describe it, but I feel like a lot of people, that's how they get their history now, is
Yeah,
historians. And I think it's the way that it's delivered. I think that it's all the audio visual stuff, it's all cleverly done, it's all cleverly edited, but it's done in a non-pompous way. Like, I've been a history nut all my life. The same as you, I studied history, I did history A level, all the rest of it. I've always been a history nut. But there's a serious thread of pomposity that goes through quite a lot of history books,
yeah,
um, and sort of a talking down to, and even from the way that a lot of history books only spoke about, from the point of view of the generals, the sort of great sweeping thing. And it wasn't until books like Band of Brothers or films
hmm
like Private Ryan came out that we started to get grunt's eye view. And I think the ending of all that elitist nonsense has garnered a huge following that I don't think
yeah.
was there in history before. And so these guys, the proper historians, they can say what they like. They're not really responsible for this huge uptick in history interest, I don't think, anyway.
Oh, I think part of it too is for the first time, really, in a mass way, people can control where they're getting their history from. If you don't like my channel, don't watch my channel. There's 500 other ones you can choose from. You'll find somebody you do like. And that's what's great about it. Find somebody that you connect with, that you can relate to, that you like their presentation style. That's why I love, for example, JD with the History Underground. I love his channel because number one, I relate to him on a personal level. And even before I knew him personally, I just felt like I understood him. The way he loved history is the way I love history, and the way he saw a battlefield was the way I saw a battlefield. And so I felt like I was there with him watching that stuff. And that's what made it accessible. And a person like me or JD before the advent of YouTube never would have had those opportunities. I never in a million years would have been on the History Channel without YouTube. because I wasn't teaching in a university and I wasn't writing a bunch of books that got me on the radar of the history world. But this gave me the opportunity to do that. Um, and the nice thing then about that is that it also has a whole community to police that. We talked about the negative of that, but it also, if somebody's got a YouTube channel and they're putting out a bunch of stuff that's nonsense about history, they won't get away with it because everybody will call them on it because the collective hive of historical knowledge is there to do that. So keeps me accountable and keeps me on my toes to make sure I'm getting it right.
Yeah. And we won't mention Daryl Cooper's name at all. And we'll just
Oh yeah.
that was
Woo.
a good video, man. That was a good video. All right.
People like it because I'm generally pretty friendly and easygoing and not real negative, but I get a lot of comments from people who like sassy vlogging through history on videos like that when I just want to beat my head against a wall over the nonsense that I'm hearing.
Well, it helped with the thumbnail was you doing this.
Yeah. Or yeah, either my head's gonna explode or my head's in my hand like I'm just disappointed dad face.
Okay, so let's get into some World War One. And so this is what I sort of majored in, and I've always had a fascination with World
Hmm.
War. And I just want to talk about the sort of the overview. We hopefully we're not getting some treacherous waters with me saying this, but as a starting off point, do you think that the perspective from which World War One is often told is kind of off slightly? Because it seems to me that it's often told, and it was, this is the bit that I have to have caveats for. It was a terrible loss of life. It was horrible slaughter. It was tragic. But it wasn't just that, was it? I feel like it's told from a perspective that misses out quite a lot of the positives. I mean, for example, I might be wrong about this, but I think about 8 out of 10 of the Tommies actually returned home. I mean, I know by
Yeah,
1918, the British Army had never functioned better. Do you know what I mean?
right,
So
right.
I'm wondering where that perspective sort of came from. I sort of read that it might have been something to do with the fact that a lot of the history was written in the 60s, but I don't know if
Hmm.
that's true.
That there is that aspect of it. I think a lot of how World War One gets viewed is through the lens of World War Two because we're on the other side of World War Two, and so inevitably there are the comparisons. And so, for example, World War One is seen as this horrible waste because in World War Two, even though overall it was a much deadlier war,
Right.
in World War II, there was a black and white good and evil. There was the good guys and the bad guys. There was the fight against tyranny and the Holocaust and what Japan was doing in China, which was equal to the Holocaust, if not worse. And so all of that makes it seem like even though it was deadlier and more destructive, it feels like it meant something. Whereas in
Right.
World War One, there were these millions of deaths. It was this trench warfare where there was very little movement. It just seems like people were attacking for no reason. D-Day was horrible, but it accomplished something. Uh, the Battle of the Bulge was, there was a lot of deaths, but it accomplished something, and there was movement, and the battle changed things. And in World War One, the Somme, 19,000 British soldiers die in a couple of hours, and nothing really was gained by it. And it wasn't really against bad guys versus good guys. And so there's all these gray areas, and there's all of this just kind of. And I feel the same thing when I go to World War One battlefields. I just feel that oppressive sense of, man, this feels so meaningless. And I think that's part of why people focus on the bad and the negative of it so much is because it does feel so much like it was just worthless and pointless and millions died for what? I don't know.
Right. No, I understand. I do understand that. I
But I see what
sometimes,
you're saying about the focus, like the focus on, there were a million people in the British Empire who died, but there were, so many millions more who didn't. And um, those kinds of things. And the outcome was the end of all these
yeah, I think what
monarchies in Europe.
I'm slightly
So there
trying
are
to,
positives that came out
yeah,
of it, but it also led to the conditions that created Nazi Germany. And so people also see that negative. And for every positive, there's a negative.
yeah, I guess I'm sort of, the more I read, the more I read, and the more I learn about it, the more I learn about what the men accomplished and what they went through. the whole narrative of the sort of lions led by donkeys, which I don't think
Yeah.
it actually said. I think that was a historian later on said there's something kind of insulting about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they were great leaders as well. They were great
They were
leaders.
great leaders, and the number of generals who died in those battles, people forget. It's not like they were all sitting back at the chateau sipping brandy and smoking cigars while they sent men to their deaths. Hundreds and hundreds of British generals died in the First World War. Many of them on the front lines, being killed by artillery and machine gun fire and things like that. Uh, and there were some fantastic generals. I mean, guys like Arthur Currie, who was this Canadian general, was fantastic. Monash was a great general. Some of the British generals were really, really good too. I mean, guys like Plumer, who was the general at Passchendaele at Ypres, fantastic British general. There were some really, really good leaders out there, and all the great generals of World War II were junior officers during that war, that lieutenants and captains and colonels. Um, Even on the American side, guys like Patton and MacArthur met on the battlefield during the St. Mihiel offensive. And Patton wrote later that there were only two guys in that battle who never ducked during the artillery barrages, and it was him and MacArthur.
That's
So,
incredible.
so
Yeah,
those are cool stories just to read those things too.
yeah. I mean, whilst we're myth busting as well, there's a theory that we were all led by sort of rich people. Wasn't Pershing the son of a farmer?
Yeah, Pershing was. I mean, Patton was kind of rich, but no, I mean, a lot of these guys, and and nobody was exempt. The prime minister's son was killed at the Somme. Uh, and the future Queen Mother, her brother was killed in the First World War, and members of the British or the German royal family were killed during the war. Nobody was exempt. The rich people were on the front lines. Winston Churchill was in the trenches as a lieutenant colonel leading a battalion, and finally figured out that he could do more good back in Parliament than he could as a lieutenant, one of hundreds of lieutenant colonels leading hundreds of battalions. But nobody was exempt. Everybody felt that they needed to do their share in that war.
And do you think the conditions of the men were overplayed as well? I mean, as far as I've read as well that the conditions of the frontline men, horrendous as they are, if you're being you know, shelled to pieces. But I mean, they were rotated out fairly
Yeah.
regularly. I think
When you were on the front line. Yeah.
food dentistry suddenly became a thing in England, because these working class guys had bad teeth, and suddenly it's like, right, we need to get them good teeth so they can absorb the
Yeah.
nutrition. And
When you were on the front line, it was horrible. It was all of those things, but you weren't in the trench for months at a time or even weeks at a time. You'd rotate maybe every 3 or 4 days. And so when you look at a map and you see, for example, okay, the 31st Division held this sector right here. It wasn't the entire 31st Division that was on the line. Maybe 20, 25% of them were. The rest were in reserve trenches or back in town. So for example, the guys in the Ypres salient in Belgium, they had a town called Poppering that was kind of in a more safe zone, maybe 10, 20 miles away from the front lines. And they would go there and they would have R&R, and they would have kind of like what the USO was in World War II, stuff like that. They had this place called Talk H, which was this house where they could go and sleep in a warm bed and get a shower and get entertainment and meet with the girls and have good food. And so, yeah, when you were on the front lines, it could be absolutely atrocious. And all of those things are true. But these guys weren't on the front lines for 4 years straight. They were on the front lines for a couple of days at a time.
wow. And do you think that I'm just kind of myth busting in my own mind as I go along? Do you think a lot of the overview of World War One is caused or shadowed by, for the French and the British anyway, the two major battles were a disastrous slaughter. I mean, Verdun was supposed to be a slaughter. That was the battle plan for the Germans, wasn't it? And then the
At
Somme.
least, yeah, in hindsight,
Yeah.
that's what they wanted everybody to think. But yeah, it was. I mean, the talk was among the Germans is bleed France white, and that was an attitude I think among all of the powers by 1916 was, all right, this is not a battle that's going to be won by outmaneuvering the enemy because there's nowhere to outmaneuver. We're on a 400-mile trench line, so now it becomes about attrition. It's kill enough of the enemy wear him down to the point where either the soldiers or the civilians back home just are tired of it and won't take anymore. And yeah, we do that in every war. We focus on the big battles and the big disasters, the Somme and Passchendaele and Verdun, battles like that. Um, but for the most part, what you have is after the fall of 1914 is that Germany has conquered most of Belgium. They've taken a nice chunk of northeastern France, and then they're digging in and daring the Allies to take it back. And so Germany digs in really tight. And yes, they go on offensives, but for the most part, it's the Allies going on the offensives. And so that's why you have things like the Somme and Passchendaele. These are major Allied offensives that are just thrown into the meat grinder. And despite what people believe, most deaths didn't happen because of poison gas or because of machine guns. Something like 70% of the deaths on the Western Front were artillery. And those
Right.
didn't all happen during the big battles. I've done a lot of research, and you were talking earlier about how we focus on the generals and the big movements, but Band of Brothers, the reason that that was so popular is because it wasn't those things. It was the soldiers. It was learning about Talbert and Winters and guys that when you think about it, there were tens of thousands of majors in the army and there were hundreds of thousands of sergeants and NCOs. But to learn a few of their stories helps us to learn all their stories in a sense, I guess. And so um, when I start researching these individual soldiers in World War One, most of these guys didn't die at the Somme or at Passchendaele or at Verdun. They died in December of 1915 while they were in their trench eating and an artillery shell landed and killed them. Or they died because their lieutenant told them to go over the top to go cut some barbed wire in no man's land, and they died during that. That's how most of it went down. And those are the stories nobody talks about because everybody wants to talk about the big battles. And
Right.
so, one of the great things then about having a YouTube channel is that I can tell whatever stories I want to. And I'm infinitely more fascinated by those individual soldier stories than I am about big unit movements. And I've tried to make it a point to do that. And that's why having tens of thousands of YouTube videos about World War One could never get old because there are tens of thousands of stories that people can tell that nobody else is telling.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, and it is like because I mean when you break it down like that, when you really think about it, I mean, if you're talking Verdun, Somme, and the major battles, there's not many of them.
No.
So what's happening in between is, it's like life's what
Yeah,
happens
what's
when
happening
you're
in
looking at the
between
time.
is the
Yeah,
focus shifts to other areas. So, for example, um, when Verdun happened, there was no plan for the Allies to make any attacks until the Somme in the summer. They were basically, I mean, there were some attacks here and there, but for the most part, they were like, all right, we're going to sit tight. If the Germans attack, we'll absorb it, but we're going to make our big attack in the summer at the Somme because that's where the British and French lines come together. Well, then Verdun happened, with the Germans attacking, and that changed all the plans because now they're like, okay, the French got to throw all kinds of men over to Verdun, and they rotated pretty much their whole army through Verdun. And that meant now the Somme's going to have to be primarily a British offensive. But yeah, for the most part, they're sitting around focusing on other areas. And so, for example, the British in 1915, they're not focused on any major offensives on the Western Front because they're shifting to places like, okay, what can we do down in Turkey and
yeah,
Gallipoli? So we're going to try another avenue. We're going to try to open up another front somewhere because right here is not working. And so it's not that things weren't going on. It's just that the focus was shifting to the Eastern Front or to the Balkans and to the Mediterranean and different places like that.
oh, okay,
So
yeah,
so I guess what I'm saying is when you focus on just the Western Front, it can look like there are huge chunks of time where nothing's happening. It's just that things were happening other places.
yeah, and that was sort of going to be my
Yeah.
next question. It was because I mean, it's you think about the Second World War, and instantly you can think about sort of the Axis powers and Italy and Japan, what happened to Japan and China and all the stuff, Guam. You can just go all the way around the
Hmm.
world in mind. Whereas with World War One, we call it World War One, but we basically focus on the Western Front. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know a great deal about what happened out east, Annenberg, and I know a little bit about it. I know that was more of a sweeping battle, but where else was there battles that you just think I didn't know that?
Oh, well, Italy joins the war in 1915, and that opens up a front in the Alps on the border with Austria-Hungary. And there's something like a dozen battles at the same spot, the battles of Isonzo. Some of the deadliest battles of the war are at Isonzo. And there's like a dozen of them, and they're up in the Alps, and you have battles up above like 10,000 feet where the artillery is being used to cause avalanches to collapse the snow down on the opposing army. It just some nasty stuff going on up in the Alps that nobody really talks about. There's huge fighting going on down in Serbia. The Serbians lose something like a quarter of their male population during the war, and nobody talks about the Balkans. But that's where the war started, was in the
Yeah.
Balkans. It started with Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. And for a couple of years, they can't really break Serbia. And it's only when you get Bulgaria and then Romania come into the war that that all kind of changes. And so, yeah, Bulgaria, Romania are in the war. So you've got fighting going on there. Romania gets pretty much knocked out of the war almost instantly. You have fighting in Africa. You have naval battles happening in South America. Um, Japan joined the war on the Allied side. Japan and Italy were allies of Britain and France in the First World War, which is funny. Italy was actually in what was called the Triple Alliance about a decade before that with Austria, Hungary, and Germany. So naturally, it made sense they would have been on the Central Power side in the war. But what Italy wanted was some land back that they thought belonged to them from the Austro-Hungarians, and Austria-Hungary wouldn't give it to them. And the Allies said, "Yeah, we'll make sure you get it if you jump in on our side." And so they did. Japan
Yeah.
jumps in the war because they want to be at the peace table afterwards to help have a voice in the new world afterwards, because there's all these German possessions in the Pacific that they want to get their hands on. So they figure, okay, if Germany's going to lose the war, we'll jump in on the Allied side so we can get some of that stuff. And so you start having all these other countries jump in because they see what's in it for them. So it does end up being kind of a world war to a lesser degree. But yeah, there was fighting on several continents during the war.
Yeah, I read a little bit about the stuff with the Italians. Is the Alpini? Is that what the soldiers were called? The
Yeah,
Italian.
yeah, yeah, and like you said, I mean, not a lot of people talk about that, but there were
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of casualties on that front, and nobody talks about it. Huge
But
part of the
also,
war.
also what elite troops those Alpini were, which I mean, it's sort of you don't think about that for Italian soldiers, not sort of generally off support.
No, but when you're
You get
dealing
a bad
with
rank.
fighting in the Alps, any little edge you can get, and if you've got guys who specialize in that kind of warfare, that's why the U.S. in World War II, we have the 10th Mountain Division. We have guys who are specifically trained to deal with that kind of stuff, and every nation ended up having those kinds of troops. The Germans, you talk about that in Band of Brothers. You have the whole scene in the Carentan episode about the guy with the Edelweiss. Um, and I can't say that I can't even talk about Edelweiss without thinking of the opening to what's that TV show, um, the fictional one set in the United States, A Man in the High Castle.
Oh yeah, yes,
Yeah,
man,
that's
that's
the opening
brilliant.
song is Edelweiss. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, first few seasons of that were wicked.
that's one
Rufus
of
Gill.
those shows that went downhill the longer it
Yeah,
went, didn't it? But
yeah.
yeah, it was really cool.
Um, I'm jumping around with this, Chris. I'm sorry, but
That's all
like
right.
my mind works in the way I think about things. One thing that I think listeners might find interesting as well, maybe I've got this slightly wrong, um, but the Allies, as far as Britain and France are concerned, so Britain joins the war to defend Belgium.
Yes.
They're not actually allied with France per se. So we're sort of fighting next to one another, but sort
Yeah.
of on the same side, but not. There's no sort of joint command, is there?
Yeah. The alliance is France and Russia. And
Right. Okay.
so, everybody talks about it, but it's that whole triggering of systems of alliances. It starts with Austria-Hungary versus Serbia, but Austria-Hungary only declared war on Serbia because they had Germany's backing, because they knew that declaring war on Serbia meant Russia joins, and if Russia joins, that means France joins. But yeah, the UK is a wild card in this because they weren't obligated by any treaties to jump in to defend France, and there was no guarantee they would have. But Germany knew that going through Belgium could mean that. And so Germany tries to avoid it. They communicate to the Belgians, listen, we're not declaring war on you, Belgium. We just want to send our army through your country so we can attack France on their kind of soft underbelly that isn't on this defended, this fortified line around places like Verdun. So the king of the Belgians said, no, you're not going to violate our sovereign territory. But he knew it was a death sentence for Belgium to try and slow down Germany, but he does. And they did just enough to buy time for the British to get some soldiers over there, for the French to get their act together and prepare for it. And even though Belgium basically gets conquered in the first few weeks of the war, they did just enough to bottle the German army up that I think you could argue that they probably saved the war between that and getting the British involved. But yeah, the British come in because of Belgium, not because of France.
Interesting, because where I'm going with this as well is famously we don't get along with the French. And
Yeah.
we fought wars against them for centuries
Hmm.
previous to this. And then suddenly we're not allies, but we're fighting alongside them. We're on the same front. We've got to coexist. We've got to start sharing information. We've got to start sharing tactics. How does that go? Does it go well or
Yes and no. It depends on the generals. And in both cases, the generals, and in the German case too. So basically, on the front line within the first year or so, all of the commanders of the various armies are replaced.
right?
So the French replace their overall commander. The British go from John French, interesting name, French, to Douglas Haig. The Germans are going to very quickly, within a month or two, switch from Moltke to Falkenhayn on the Western Front. And then eventually they're going to replace him with Ludendorff and Hindenburg. So there's all this turnover with these generals. And so some of them get along pretty well, others not so much. And even in the French army, they're not getting along with each other. You have the overall commanders not getting along with some of their underlings because everybody's thinking, how can I rise up and be the man instead of the man who is the man? But eventually, I think it starts to get better. And then the same thing happens when the Americans come in 1917, is the same thing. And a lot of what we focused on the History Channel documentary is that when Pershing comes over as commander of the American Army, he's got instructions from Woodrow Wilson and from the higher ups that the Americans are not going to be there to be under British command or under French command. Americans are going to serve as Americans, and we want our own section of the line. And that's what the British end up doing is instead of mixing and matching, it's like, okay, the British sector is here. It's in Belgium and kind of it's basically from the Somme on the right flank up into Belgium and Ypres on the left flank, so to speak. The French are going to be basically everything to the right of them. The Belgians are going to be everything to the left of them. So the way they solve that problem is give everybody their own piece of the pie, so to speak. And so then the Americans want that too. And so Pershing comes in and says, no, we want an American sector. And they're like, no, we need you where we need you. And so we're going to take an American division here and give it to the British, and we're going to take another American division and give it to the French. And they don't want that. And so there's that, yeah, contest of wills to where everybody's fighting with each other. But eventually, late in the war, the Allies are going to basically get their own version of Eisenhower. And it's Joseph Joffre, who is or I'm sorry, not Joseph Joffre, it's Ferdinand Foch. Ferdinand Foch, who is the overall commander, and he is the commander in chief, and he is the Eisenhower. He's pulling all the strings, he's giving the orders. And so then what they do is basically, so if you're the British, if you're Haig, you're saying, okay, Joffre, you're in charge. You're going to tell us where we're going to attack, but you don't get to decide how I deploy my men. I still get to decide how we attack and where, what division goes where. So they can still feel like they're doing it themselves. But yeah, they eventually figure out that they need a commander in chief. So they work it out. And I think that gives the Allies some important lessons for World War II. It's to not repeat that same mistake. So they very quickly decide Eisenhower is supreme commander in Europe. We're not going to mess around with this whole everybody doing their own thing.
Yeah, because you run a serious risk if you show up late in the war with a bunch of fresh men and say, we want our own section of the line. And everyone's going to go, it's the most dangerous section.
Yeah. No, yeah, and it ends up the Americans don't
Yeah.
initially get that. And that's why you get guys fighting at Belleau Wood, for example. Belleau Wood is nowhere near where the American sector of the line ends up being, but it was
Right.
where American troops were needed because the Germans had launched this huge offensive in the spring of 1918. And so American troops were just needed to plug the gaps in some places. And so they're spreading them out all over the place. That's what they had to do. But it was with the promise that when the time came, the Americans would get their own part of the line. And they get that kind of in the southern part of the Western Front, down around Saint Mihiel and Meuse Argonne, and the area around Verdun is where the Americans are going to get their own part of the pie.
Right. And so I'll sort of like myth bust a couple of other things with you, and then we'll sort of move on. We've spoken about it before. So there's a myth that it's sort of like a bunch of guys going over the top for 4 years and nothing really changes. But in that 4 years, the technical advances have
Hmm.
gone from the sort of 19th century to just in 4 years, unbelievable technical advances in
Yeah,
artillery.
even at the start of the war, you have these huge artillery pieces. You have machine guns that can just wipe out a whole company instantly. And as is often the case, the technology is ahead of the tactics, and so then the tactics have to catch up.
Right.
Throughout the course of the war, air power becomes a major thing. A lot of people don't realize that the Germans were sending bombers to bomb places like London and Birmingham during World War One. It wasn't just in World War Two that you had the Blitz. You had the UK being bombed by air power in World War One. So air power, bombs, all that stuff. And so they start to change the tactics. It don't doesn't become the human wave anymore. By 1917, the Germans, for example, develop stormtroopers,
Mm-hmm.
and they do these infiltration tactics. It's the advent of what you see in World War II, which a lot of stuff you had to learn for Band of Brothers, where the small group tactics, the squads of guys laying down a base of fire and getting around and infiltrating, and all of that was born toward the end of World War One out of an act of necessity to avoid these headlong tactics where guys were just being mown down by artillery and machine gun fire in massive amounts.
Oh, the beginnings of Blitzkrieg as well, with like Vimy
Yeah,
Ridge, where you have all air power and creeping barrage and tank,
absolutely. It's
all
the creeping bra.
culminating.
Yeah, it's combined arms. It's like you said, air power, artillery, and blitzkrieg. That's really what the stormtroopers were for the Germans, was a an infantry form of blitzkrieg. It was pinprick assaults that then open up the opportunity to send in the army.
Yeah.
Just like in World War II, was send in the tanks, but you're not going to win a war just with tanks. You have to have infantry. You have to have strength behind it. And that's what those tactics were. Yeah, I mean, so many of the lessons that were perfected in World War II were first learned in World War One because of the changing nature of warfare.
And so just to put a button on it before we sort of move on a little bit, the last thing that is generally sort of thought about World War One is that it ended in a stalemate and there were no real winners.
Mm,
But that's
yeah,
not true, is it?
the people say that because it was an armistice, but it was a surrender in all but name for the Germans. So, you have this brief moment in 1917 when the Russians are basically out of the war because the Russians uh, have this revolution. And in the early months of 1917, the Tsar is forced to step down, and then they go to civil war, and so basically they're out of the war as 1917 goes on. April 1917, the Americans enter the war on the side of the Allies, but the U.S. doesn't have an army. And so they know that it's going to take them a year or more to build up to the numbers that are necessary to make a difference. And so the Germans know there's a brief window where fighting has collapsed on the Eastern Front, but the Americans haven't arrived on the Western Front. And so they pile up all the divisions they can, and they launch the spring offensive in 1918, sometimes called the Ludendorff Offensive or the Kaiserschlacht. It's a series of offensives. And they aren't able to break through. Their idea is we're going to break through the line. We're going to cut off the British,
Right.
that spot where they come together, cut off the British, force them out of the war, and then get France to give up because France has been going through mutinies. They're in danger of a civil war. France is on the verge of being out of the war because of the casualties that they're taking. So the Germans launch this one last gasp to do that. And in doing that, they exhaust what little manpower and resources they have left. So then in the summer of 1918, the Allies are going to launch a counteroffensive. They call it the 100 Days Offensive. And part of that for the Americans is the Meuse-Argonne, which was our sector of the 100 Days Offensive. And Germany just is overrun. And by September of 1918, you have the commanders on the Western Front, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, telling the Kaiser, we're done. We cannot win this war. It's over. Negotiate while you can and get the best terms you can. And the Allies are like, forget that. You have to give up and just basically quit. And then we'll call it that. And they keep attacking even to the morning. So it was a surrender. The Germans, the Kaiser steps down. The Germans come to Campania to meet with Ferdinand Foch, the Allied commander in chief. And Foch basically tells them, here's the list of demands. Agree to all of them or we keep fighting. And Germany finally says we have no choice. We have to accept this, and it was a surrender. So it was absolutely a defeat, a catastrophic defeat for Germany in that war, even though we don't necessarily call it that. It was.
And is some of that lost to the retelling from Adolf Hitler in his
Yeah,
writing?
Hitler's there. Hitler's there on the front lines during all of this, and
He's saying it wasn't. We were stabbed in the back by our leaders and whoever else.
yep, and it became blaming certain groups of people.
Yeah.
And you even have Matthias Erzberger, who was the lead negotiator for the Germans in the armistice, is assassinated a couple years later as part of that whole stab in the back myth, is that our civilian authorities failed us. If the military had been allowed to continue, they would have won. But that denies the fact that the military leaders themselves were saying, we can't win this war. They knew they couldn't win, but it was. People say that history is written by the victors, but not always. The history in Germany was definitely written by the losers who tried to redefine it as we were betrayed because Germany would never lose a war like that. If we had been allowed to fight, we would have won. And it was definitely a retelling of history.
Excellent. Okay, so one final question. How many traffic lights are there in London?
I was just there and I couldn't tell you. I've never driven in London. So, oh man. That was in Bastogne a couple years ago, and you were roasting people, and you roasted me over my short on the history of traffic lights. Hey, just a reminder though, I know you're in London, but I'm in Ohio right now. The first electric traffic light was here in Northeast Ohio, so which you know because you watched the video.
I did, and you're ducking the question. The answer is 4,700. I looked it up.
Dang, I wouldn't have thought there was. I don't know. I think I would have thought that there would have been more than that, but maybe not.
Okay, so I've got some other questions for you, and let's see how you do with this.
Oh boy.
It's to do with West Bromwich Albion.
Oh boy.
Okay, name me some of the silverware they've won, and when did they win what is now the Premiership, that was then League One?
Oh wow. Well, I know they've won an FA Cup at some point, but it was a long time ago.
5.
They've won 5 FA Cups? Oh
Mm-hmm.
my gosh, I am horrible. I should have known that. But the last time they won the top flight, oh gosh, it's got to be. Was it in the 50s?
1920.
1920. That was the I'm Cleveland, we call them the Guardians now, but we've only won 2 World Series, and one was in 1920 and one was in 48. 1920. Now we'd just be happy to get back to the Premier League.
Yeah, yeah. I'll go through it so I don't put you on the spot. They also won the Community Shield, which I think became the Charity Shield in 1920 as well, and in 1955. And they won the FA Cup in 1888.
Nice. That was 10 years after they started. Yeah.
1892. So we're talking about a golden era. 1931, 1954, and 1968. So they were still
68. Okay, that was the one I was thinking of. I think I thought that was the only one. Was the one in the 60s.
Yeah.
Okay.
There
Wow.
you go. And hang on, let me see if I can do it. Barnsley, which is pretty much my football team, have only ever won the FA Cup once, and it was in 1912. And the team was Cooper, Downs, Glendenning, Bratley, Utley, Bartrop, Lillycrop, Travers, Moore, and I can never remember the 11th one. But as I'm sure all of you know it, just write in and tell me.
Nice. And see, the only player I could even name from 1912 played for Villa, and that's
Yeah.
because he was my cousin. His name was Sammy Whitaker. He was a forward for Aston Villa.
Please tell me you have a picture of him and he looks just like you.
He
Or with
looks
like,
nothing like me. I have
oh,
way more hair than him. But yeah, there are pictures available of him from when he played for Villa back in the day. And then he played for Villa up until the Great War, and then he went off to fight just like a lot of those guys did. So
and then you thought you'd stab him in the back by becoming a West Brom fan?
I actually went back and forth between Villa and West Brom, and I decided on West Brom. And I shouldn't, well, I mean, I shouldn't say I should have. I shouldn't have. But the year that I chose West Brom, Villa was still in the championship,
Right.
and they played each other in the playoff, and it went to penalty kicks, and Villa won. And I should have known then that I had made a horrible mistake, but I didn't. So
Yeah. Yes. You're mirroring my life as a Welsh rugby fan. My father being Welsh, I've spent a life of tragedy and misery supporting the Welsh rugby team, and it's just getting worse. I've had you for almost an hour, Chris, and I always ask this of all my prey. I subhead the podcast to Nearly Men. So I always ask, and I don't know if I've done this before with you, because I know we've chatted before in different formats. Is there something that you could have nearly been other than famous YouTuber?
yeah.
Like I often have a lot of actors on. I say, like, is there a part you nearly could have got? Like,
Oh
weirdly,
yeah.
in this close to being Bond or Spider-Man.
The nearly for me, and I wouldn't say that I would have ever gained the amount of fame I have as a YouTuber, but uh 10, 12 years ago, I had a pretty good musical career going on, writing and performing. I was doing 8, 10 gigs a month, traveling to multiple states, performing, playing in coffee houses and wineries and churches and things like that. And it was going pretty well, and I was making a pretty decent amount of money doing it. Yeah. And I had just recorded my second full album of music that I had written, and just kind of walked away from all of it, and ended up being a public speaker for Rachel's Challenge instead.
What genre of music?
A little bit of everything. I was because I was still in ministry. I was writing a lot of Christian music, but a lot of country as well. And I was even like cover songs of Garth Brooks. I would do a lot of Garth Brooks songs and stuff like that because my voice is pretty similar to his. So it was one that worked for me. But yeah, a lot, probably mostly country is where I probably would have had a potential for something.
That's fantastic. What great answer. You're a dark horse.
Again, I'm not saying I know how hard it is to get famous, but I never would have thought that I would have been famous on YouTube either. So who knows?
Well, just get out the guitar now as well, because you become famous as a musician on YouTube as well. Social media is
That's true. Justin Bieber, that all it was YouTube is how he got his start. So yeah.
yeah. I know I'm a believer. I know I'm a believer. Well, listen, Chris, thanks so much for coming on, especially at this late notice. I did that thing where I'd assumed I'd told you and then told you about 48 hours ago.
Oh,
Thank
no
you.
worries. I'm always glad. Always glad to chat with you.
Cheers, buddy. Thanks very much
All
for
right.
coming on.
Yep. Take care.
Cheers, buddy. Bye. Well, all right. I think I'm still recording. I think it's still me. Leighton had something else to do. I'm kind of blurry. And fighting off a cold, which has finally got me. But that was really good, wasn't it? I think so. I love nerding out with Chris Mowery. He's a really good guy. He's a really great speaker. And he's great when he comes on our tours. I'd like to get him more involved. He did a great speech on one of his relatives when we were on the last tour. Brought a tear to his own eye and to everybody else's. Anyway, I shall let you go as it's just me, and I'm not sure how to round up by myself, but I'm going to head out of here. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next week.